Hello, welcome to today's screencast, Sports Psychology. The focus is on the inverted U theory of arousal. Now, just to have a quick recap, previous lesson we had a look at the drive theory of arousal, and I think it's quite important we just have a quick look. You don't need to make notes here, but just to have a look and just see where we left off last lesson. So, what the drive theory proposed is that as arousal increases, so too does performance of the dominant response, okay? And the dominant response is dictated on how well we have learned a motor program. So for autonomous performers, high arousal equals high performance because they've got a well-learned motor program, whereas for cognitive performers, high arousal equals low performance or has a negative effect on performance because they've got a poorly learned motor program, if you remember that idea. Now, when we evaluated it, I'm just going to show you the negative evaluations of these. If you remember, something to do with the fact that this line, okay, if you have a look at it here, it will keep going. Firstly, it's to do with its first shape. Secondly, the fact it just keeps going this way. And they were the disadvantages. So the disadvantages were it's too simplistic a model. Okay, just to have a linear relationship like this. Okay, it also didn't explain poor performance for elite players under high arousal. So why is it that Johnny Wilkinson ever missed a kick in an important rugby game when he was pumped up? Okay, why is it that Cristiano Ronaldo misses free kicks or penalties in a final? Not always, but occasionally. Because this theory would say that if it was true, it would say that every single top class performer, when they're under high arousal in a final, they are always going to perform at their optimal. It's not true. Okay, so it doesn't explain poor performance for elite players under high arousal. Finally, it does not take into account over arousal for elite performers. So remember, if a dominant response is well learned, aka an autonomous performer, high arousal equals high performance. It doesn't even take into account over arousal, which brings us these three key weaknesses of the drive theory. Brings us to our second theory, which I started the screencast by talking about. It's called the inverted U theory, and as you can see on here, there's a very, very different shape. Okay, you might say the first part of it goes up a bit like the drive theory, but as you can see, it is then taken over by a curve down like this. Okay, so what we need to do then, let's have a look at how we describe it, how it will combat some of the problems that are shown in the drive theory. Well, straight away you can see that there is such thing as over arousal, okay, and it does explain why people's elite performance will deteriorate under high arousal. Okay, so both of those things, and it's not simplistic in terms of shape. You can see that straight away. Okay, so let's have a look then, how we describe it. Very, very basic on here. So inverted U theory proposes that as arousal increases, performance increases up to an optimal midpoint. Okay, and the key thing here is that any further increases in arousal lead to a gradual decrease in performance. So if I just use the cursor to show you what we're talking about there, as arousal increases, as arousal goes that way, performance will increase, okay, up to an optimal midpoint. So when it gets to this stage here, that is the optimal midpoint. Any continued rise in arousal will lead to, as you can see here, it curves down. So performance, if it was the drive theory, it would just carry on like that. Okay, but because it's the inverted U theory, this one, any further increases in arousal will lead to a gradual decrease in performance. And I think best thing to do now, once you've got that down, that's a description, has to be that. Okay, now what we have to do is we have to be able to give a little bit of an example of the three levels of arousal. And what I'm going to do is stick your example linked to one concrete example. Now, I'm going to use this. You can apply this to your own sport. So the concrete example I'm going to use to put this theory in action is the goalkeeper catch in football. Now, this could be a fullback catching a high ball in rugby. It could be a goalkeeper catching a long pass in netball. Whatever your sport is, try and think of something that can link. But for now, use my concrete example. So let's have a look then. So the theory says, according to this, as arousal increases performance increases up to an optimal midpoint, a gradual any further increase will lead to a gradual decrease. So what this theory is saying, if you've got low arousal, your performance is poor. If you've got high arousal, your performance is poor, because you can see here the performance levels are relatively low there, relatively low there. So what we have to do, use this example, give a little bit of a descriptor for each level of arousal, and then apply it to our example of a goalkeeper catch in football. So let's have a look at the first one then. Low arousal. So low arousal equals poor performance. And there is a theoretical justification for this. So low arousal leads to poor performance because the attentional field width is too wide. Now what this means is when you're daydreaming okay, and you're not really low arousal, you're not pumped up at all. What it means is you pick up loads of cues from outside. So you pick up loads of things. You're looking at people walking around the pitch. You're not focusing. You're thinking about something you did last night, and that is when your attentional field width goes really wide, and you're taking in things you shouldn't be. Now this then, if we link it to our goalkeeper catching football, would mean when a ball got crossed in, the goalkeeper would miss the ball. Okay, completely miss it. And you can see how that might work. Flipping around, when it's in moderate arousal, which remember is our optimal arousal, this will lead to optimal performance. Okay, so this will lead to optimal performance. Again, we use attentional field width because it is the ideal width, and this is when you're focused, you've got that perfect, you're in the zone. Okay, you're focused on everything around, you're picking up cues that you need to. You see a winger, for example, in football crossing the ball in straight away, the goalkeeper is focused. Okay, now because their attentional field width is ideal, they're picking up the right cues. What does this mean? A goalkeeper catches the ball, and if we flip it over, I'm sure you can start to work out this last one now. So for high arousal, again, as you can see, performance comes down this way, so it's poor performance. At this time, again, it's slightly different. So if when we're under arousal, have low arousal, our attentional field width is too wide. When we are under high arousal, this is when our attentional field width narrows excessively. Now, let me give you an example of this out of context. Let's say, for example, you're learning to drive, okay, your first couple of driving lessons, and you know the instructor is watching you and judging you, and when they do that, it can kind of make you feel really quite anxious, or your arousal gets really high. What this does is it narrows your attentional field width, and it stops you from seeing things that you should be seeing, okay? You're almost too stressed, and it's a term is linked to something called hyper-vigilance. You're over-vigilant. And what this means for a goalkeeper when catching it is, you could just say, well, goalkeeper trying to catch the ball, they might completely miss it, but more likely is they're almost so focused on the ball that when they try to catch it, they drop it. Okay, so they drop the ball. Okay, so with this one, it could be misses the ball, or I put here fumbles it. Okay, so you've seen people when they're almost so intense that they get their hands on the ball and drop it. Okay, but you could just say misses the ball if you want to make it easier. So that's how you apply your three examples to that. In the exam, realistically, you probably have to link an example to one of the three levels of arousal. Okay, that's your start point, basic description. Then you've got to give examples of low arousal, moderate arousal, high arousal, and then, well, make sure your examples, goalkeeper catching football, link them to those, and then by the end of the lesson, you might be able to use your own examples. Now, at this point, that is the majority of your theory done. Okay, to be honest, that is the understanding of the inverted U theory. However, I feel that, as an A-level group, it's really important that I give you some information. It has been in mark schemes, so I think this is something that might stand you out at the top level. Like most theories, when this theory initially came out, it was just considered like this, okay, exactly as it was. However, like the drive theory, it was modified, and I think you will probably, using previous knowledge, start to understand why it was modified. So the reason why the inverted U theory was modified was because it asked the question, is the optimal point of arousal always moderate? Okay, do we always perform optimally when we are moderately or medium aroused? Okay, and I think that then, hopefully what you said, so what this theory, the modification of the theory, had to look at the fact, well, actually, there's a good chance that you could have optimal performance. Your optimal arousal level could be high, which is the one on the right here, or your optimal arousal could be low. So some skills will be performed optimally under low arousal, like this, or some reasons, and on the flip side to that, some factors might encourage or lead to optimal performance under high arousal. The key thing here is the theory is talking about optimal points, so it's talking about when performance is good. So hopefully you can see what that is. We should know from previous knowledge that there are three key variables that will dictate whether performance, our performance under different levels of arousal. So let's see if we know what they are. Okay, so first one's down here: personality type, ability or stage of learning, task type. So I hope people can understand this. So first thing we have to know is then, if we have a look at it from this point, low arousal will lead to optimal performance for introverts, cognitive performers, and fine and complex skills. Now, I'm not going to talk too much about these now, but I'm sure you can remember the reasons why introverts perform optimally at low arousal because they've got a highly sensitive reticular activating system. You don't have to write that. Cognitive performers perform their best for what their ability level is at low arousal because they haven't really learnt the motor program yet, and fine and complex skills are better performed at low arousal because of the intricate or the small muscle movements used and the high decision making. On the flip side, of course, high arousal leads to optimal performance for extroverts, autonomous performers, and gross and simple skills. Because if you remember the key things about those, extroverts have a less sensitive reticular activating system, which means they strive, they want high arousal to perform optimally. Autonomous performers have a really well learnt motor program, so high arousal leads to optimal performance for them. And then gross and simple skills, they are performed best with high arousal because gross skills have large muscle movements and little intricacy, and simple skills do not have high levels of decision making or information processing, so it can be performed well under high arousal. Okay, so you don't have to put any of the descriptions in there. I thought it was just important for me to talk about those. So that is it. So what really ultimately you're doing, you, the top students, will be able to talk about the modification of the inverted U theory. And I'm just putting these in because when we have to give advantages of the inverted U theory, we can use the basic inverted U theory, the first one, and we will always get marks for when you're giving the strengths of the theory. You can talk about how it was modified to talk about low arousal and high arousal leading to optimal performance for your 3 different sections. Okay, so in the lesson we'll have a look at the evaluation points, a couple of strengths, a couple of weaknesses, but this is your key basis of basic description of the inverted U. You have to have the first slide. There is just no way you can miss that, and this is for those people looking for the A's and A stars to make sure we've got this key bit in. Okay, thanks very much.